In the winter of 1887, on the frozen streets of Cheyenne, a scream pierced the blizzard that changed the course of history for 3 lives. A desperate widow, starving and hunted, did the unthinkable. She tried to give her own children away to strangers just to keep them alive. She expected judgment. She expected cruelty. But she didn't expect him, a solitary drifter with a shadowed past who spoke 6 words that terrified the town's corrupt elite and sparked a manhunt across the Wyoming territory. "You're all coming with me." This isn't just a story about survival. It's the true, brutal account of the O'Malley family, the cattle baron who wanted them dead, and the vengeance that cost everything. This is the legend of the Iron Divide. The wind in the Wyoming territory didn't just blow, it stripped the skin. It was late November, 1887, and the town of Cheyenne was buried under 3 feet of snow, with drifts piling up against the storefronts like frozen waves. Clara O'Malley stood outside the blackened windows of the Union Pacific Depot, shivering so violently her teeth clicked together like dice in a cup. She wore a coat that had once been wool, but was now little more than threadbare patches held together by hope and desperation. Clinging to her legs were her 2 children, 7-year-old Toby, whose lips were a terrifying shade of blue, and 4-year-old Rose, who had stopped crying hours ago, a silence that scared Clara more than the screaming. They had been running for 3 weeks, 3 weeks of sleeping in barns, stealing dried corn from cattle troughs, and looking over their shoulders for the men with the silver badges and the black hearts. But the running ended today. Clara had $2 left. Not enough for 3 tickets. Not enough for a room. Just enough to buy a bottle of whiskey for a man or a warm meal for 2 children. A carriage pulled up to the platform, the horses snorting steam into the frigid air. It was a brougham, polished and expensive, the kind that belonged to the cattle barons who ruled the territory like kings. A man and a woman stepped out, wrapped in buffalo furs that cost more than Clara had earned in her entire life. Clara didn't think. Instinct took the wheel. She lunged forward, falling to her knees in the slush, the ice water soaking instantly through her dress. "Please!" she shrieked, the sound tearing from her raw throat. "Please, sir! Ma'am!" The man, a portly figure with a thick grey mustache, named Alderman Thaddeus Blackwood, recoiled, clutching his cane. "Get back, woman! Have you no shame?" "Take them," Clara sobbed, shoving Toby and Rose toward the bewildered couple. The children resisted, clinging to her freezing hands, but she pushed them away with a strength born of pure panic. "Take my babies. They're good children. They work hard. Toby can haul wood. Rose, she barely eats. Please just take them on the train. Take them east. Anywhere but here." "Mama, no," Toby screamed, fighting to get back to her. "Hush, Toby!" Clara snapped, her eyes wild. She looked up at Mrs. Blackwood, seeing the disgust on the woman's powdered face. "I can't feed them. I can't keep them warm. If they stay with me tonight, they die. Do you hear me? They die. Take them as servants. Take them as anything. Just don't let them freeze." A crowd had gathered. In the Wild West, tragedy was common, but this was a spectacle. Men in rough canvas coats watched from the saloon porch, murmuring. But no one stepped forward. To interfere with the destitute was to invite their bad luck onto yourself. Alderman Blackwood sneered, using the tip of his cane to push Clara's shoulder back, knocking her into the mud. "We are not an orphanage, madam. Step aside, or I will call the marshal." "I'm begging you." Clara crawled forward, grabbing the hem of the woman's fur coat. "I'll die right here. I don't care. Just save them." The rejection was absolute. The couple turned their backs, stepping toward the station doors. Clara collapsed, her forehead resting against the frozen mud, her sobbing turning into a high, keening wail of defeat. She pulled Toby and Rose back into her arms, trying to shield them with her own freezing body, waiting for the end. That was when the shadow fell over them. It wasn't the shadow of a building. It was a man. He was massive, blocking out the pale winter sun. He wore a duster coat made of heavy, oiled canvas that smelled of wood smoke, wet horse, and gun oil. His hat was pulled low, obscuring his eyes, but the stubble on his jaw was grey and hard as iron filings. The crowd went silent. They knew the look of a man who sold violence for a living. He stood there for a long moment, the snow gathering on the brim of his hat. He looked at the retreating rich couple, then down at the heap of rags and misery that was Clara O'Malley. "Get up," the man said. His voice was like grinding gravel. Clara looked up, terrified. I don't have money. I'm sorry, sir." The man didn't move. I said, "Get up." He reached down. His hand was the size of a shovel, wrapped in a scarred leather glove. He grabbed Clara by the arm and hoisted her to her feet, as if she weighed nothing. He looked at Toby, then at Rose. "You trying to sell off your kin?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. "I'm trying to save them," Clara whispered, shame burning her cheeks hotter than the frostbite. "I have nothing. The cold. It's going to take them tonight." The cowboy looked around the circle of onlookers. His gaze was challenging, predatory. The men on the porch looked away. The alderman who had paused at the door looked back nervously. The cowboy turned back to Clara. He reached into his coat. Clara flinched, expecting a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a heavy coin purse. He didn't hand it to her. "My wagon is over at the livery," he said. "It's got a canvas cover and a stove. You take the boy. I'll take the girl." Clara froze. You want my children?" "No," the man said, turning to walk away, expecting her to follow. "I said go to the wagon. You're all coming with me." "Me?" Clara stammered. "But why?" The cowboy stopped and looked back over his shoulder. One piercing blue eye was visible under the hat. "'Cause cows get separated from the herd. They die. Wolves pick 'em off. I don't like wolves." He scooped Rose up into one arm. The little girl didn't even cry. She just buried her face in the warmth of his duster. "Name's Jed," he grunted. "Jed Vance. Move your feet, woman, before you freeze to the ground." As they walked away toward the livery stables, a man in a bowler hat standing in the shadows of the alleyway struck a match, lighting a cigar. He watched them go, his eyes narrowing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a telegram that read, "Find the widow. Recover the ledger. No witnesses." The man smiled, blew out the match, and stepped into the snow to follow them. The interior of Jed Vance's wagon was a different world. It wasn't luxurious, but it was dry. A small cast-iron stove, bolted to the floorboards, radiated a heat that made Clara's skin prickle painfully as the blood rushed back into her extremities. They were miles outside of Cheyenne now, the town lights swallowed by the blizzard behind them. The wagon rocked and creaked, pulled by two massive draft horses that Jed called Thunder and Grief. Jed sat at the front, handling the reins through a slit in the canvas, while Clara and the children huddled in the back on a pile of buffalo robes. Toby was already asleep, his mouth open, a half-eaten piece of hardtack clutched in his hand. Rose was awake, watching Clara with wide, serious eyes. "Mama," Rose whispered. "Is that man a bad man?" Clara smoothed Rose's matted hair. "I don't know, baby. But we're warm. That's all that matters right now." The wagon lurched to a halt. The canvas flap opened, and Jed crawled in, bringing a gust of snow with him. He secured the flap and sat on a crate across from them. In the orange glow of the stove fire, Clara finally got a good look at him. He was older than she had thought, perhaps 50. His face was a map of hard living, etched with lines from the sun and wind. A long, jagged white scar ran from his left ear down to his collarbone, disappearing under his shirt. He took off his hat, revealing hair that was thick and steel grey. He pulled a tin pot from the stove and poured coffee into 2 tin mugs, handing one to Clara. "Drink," he ordered, "then talk." Clara wrapped her hands around the hot metal. "Thank you, Mr. Vance. You saved our lives." "I ain't looking for thanks," Jed said, pulling a piece of dried beef from his pocket and cutting a slice with a terrifyingly sharp Bowie knife. "I'm looking for the truth. A woman don't try to give away her own flesh and blood in front of a train station just 'cause she's broke. There's shelters in Cheyenne. Churches." "The churches wouldn't take us," Clara said bitterly. "They said we were marked." Jed paused, the knife hovering near his mouth. "Marked by who?" Clara hesitated. Every instinct told her to lie, to say it was just debt or a gambling husband. But she looked at this man, this mountain of a human being who had picked up her daughter as gently as a porcelain doll, and she felt a strange pull. "My husband was Elias O'Malley," she said softly. Jed's eyes didn't flicker, but the air in the wagon seemed to grow heavier. He slowly lowered the knife. "Elias? The surveyor?" Clara nodded, tears welling up again. "He worked for the Territory Land Office. 2 months ago, he came home early. He was scared. He told me to pack bags. He said he found something in the survey maps for the Bitter Creek expansion. Something that didn't match the bank's records." "Discrepancies," Jed muttered. "The next day," Clara's voice trembled, "they found him in the creek. The sheriff said he got drunk and fell off his horse. Drowned." She looked up, her eyes blazing with a sudden, fierce anger. "Elias didn't drink. Not a drop. Not since Toby was born. And then the house burned down," Jed guessed. It wasn't a question. 3 days later, Clara confirmed. "We barely got out. I went to the sheriff, a man named Grady. I told him it was arson. He told me I should leave the territory if I knew what was good for me. He said, accidents happen to widows who talk too much." Jed took a long sip of his coffee. "So you ran." "I ran. But they followed. Everywhere we stopped. Laramie, Rawlins, men would show up, asking questions, looking for a book. Elias's field journal." Jed leaned forward. "Do you have it?" Clara instinctively pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the hard rectangular lump sewn into the lining of her corset. It was the only thing of value she had left. "If I say yes," Clara whispered, "will you throw us out into the snow?" Jed stared at her for a long time. The wind howled outside, shaking the wagon frame. Finally, he reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a tarnished silver pocket watch. He clicked it open. Inside wasn't a clock face, but a small, faded daguerreotype picture of a woman and a young boy. "I knew Elias," Jed said, his voice rougher than before. "Years ago. Before he was a surveyor. We rode together, driving cattle up from Texas on the Chisholm Trail. He was a greenhorn, soft hands. But he had a good heart. He saved my life in Abilene when a card game went sour." Clara gasped. "He never mentioned you." "I ain't the kind of man you mention to your wife," Jed said dryly. He snapped the watch shut. "If Elias O'Malley got killed, it's 'cause he found out who's really stealing the land in this territory. And if they're hunting you, it means you're the loose end." "Who is it?" Clara asked. "Who is behind it?" "There's only one man in Wyoming with enough money to buy a sheriff and enough hate to burn a widow's house," Jed said. "Colt Ransom." The name hung in the air like a curse. Colt Ransom was the head of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. He owned half the politicians in Cheyenne and all of the judges. "He wants the journal," Clara said. "Elias wrote it all down. Ransom is fencing off public water. He's starving out the small homesteaders to take their deeds for pennies." Jed nodded slowly. "And if that book gets to the U.S. Marshal in Denver, Ransom hangs." Suddenly, the horses outside screamed. Jed moved with a speed that defied his size. In one motion, he doused the lantern, plunging the wagon into darkness. He grabbed a Winchester repeater rifle from the rack above his head and kicked the wagon flap open. "Get down!" he hissed at Clara. "On the floor! Cover the kids!" Clara threw herself over Toby and Rose, pressing their faces into the buffalo robes. Crack! A gunshot splintered the wood of the wagon frame, inches from where Jed's head had been a second before. "Stay down!" Jed roared. He rolled out of the back of the wagon, landing in the snow, and disappeared into the swirling white darkness. Clara lay trembling in the dark, the smell of gunpowder stinging her nose. She heard the distinct lever-action crank of Jed's rifle. Clack, clack. Then the roar of gunfire erupted, drowning out the wind. The world outside the canvas wagon had turned into a white void of violence. The wind screamed like a banshee, masking the crunch of boots on snow, turning every shadow into a potential killer. Inside the wagon, Clara O'Malley pressed her body over her children, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Toby was sobbing silently, his face buried in the buffalo robe, while Rose lay frozen, her eyes wide and unblinking, reflecting the orange glow of the dying stove fire. Crack! Peasing. Another bullet tore through the wagon's sideboards, shattering a jar of pickled peaches on a shelf. The vinegar smell mixed instantly with the acrid scent of fear. "Mama?" Rose whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't move," Clara hissed, her hand gripping the back of the girl's head. "Don't you make a sound." Outside, Jed Vance was a ghost. He had rolled under the carriage of the wagon, the snow soaking instantly through his duster. He lay on his back in the slush, his breath held tight in his chest. He counted the flashes in the dark. 1 from the tree line, 2 from the ridge, 3 men, professionals. They weren't shooting wild. They were suppressing fire, keeping him pinned while they moved in. Jed shifted his Winchester, the cold steel biting into his cheek. He waited. He knew how these men worked. They were impatient. The cold made men sloppy. He saw a dark shape detach itself from the white swirl of the blizzard, moving toward the horses. They were going to cut the traces, spook the team, and leave the wagon stranded to freeze. Jed didn't hesitate. He tracked the shadow, led the target by an inch, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against his shoulder. The roar was deafening in the silence of the storm. The shadow jerked violently and collapsed into the snow, thrashing once before going still. "Damn it! He's under the wagon!" a voice shouted from the ridge. "Flush him out, Vicar!" Bullets chewed up the snow around the wheels, sending sprays of ice into Jed's face. He scrambled backward, crab-walking through the deep drift to get behind the cover of a large pine tree. He checked his ammo. 5 rounds left in the tube. "Come out, Vance!" The voice drifted through the wind. "We don't want you. We want the woman and the book. Give 'em up and you ride away." Jed spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the white snow. It looked like blood in the moonlight. "You boys are a long way from home," he yelled back, his voice booming. "Colt Ransom send you to kill women?" "Ransom sends his regards," the voice sneered. Then silence. Jed knew what was happening. They were flanking him. 1 left, 1 right. He was pinned. If he stayed, he died. If he moved, they saw him. He looked back at the wagon. The canvas was flapping in the wind. If he died, Clara and the kids would be dead within the hour, either by a bullet or the cold. Jed reached into his duster pocket and pulled out a stick of dynamite. It was old, sweating slightly, unstable. He usually used it for clearing stumps on the ranch he didn't have any more. He struck a lucifer match against the bark of the pine tree. The flame flared, blue and desperate. He lit the fuse. "Catch!" Jed roared. He hurled the stick over the wagon, toward the ridge where the voice had come from. He didn't wait to see it land. He dove face first into the snow, covering his head. Boom! The explosion shook the ground. A massive plume of snow, dirt, and pine needles erupted into the air. The horses screamed, rearing up in their traces, rocking the wagon violently. Inside, Clara screamed as the wagon lurched, pots and pans crashing down around them. Jed was up and moving before the debris settled. He sprinted through the smoke, his rifle leveled. He found the second man stumbling in the crater the dynamite had made, ears bleeding, stunned. Jed didn't shoot. He reversed his rifle and slammed the walnut stock into the man's temple. The man dropped like a sack of feed. "Behind you!" Clara's scream pierced the air. Jed spun around. The third man, Vicar, was standing 10 feet away, a sawed-off shotgun leveled at Jed's chest. He had come around the blind side of the wagon. He was smiling, his teeth yellow in the darkness. "End of the road, cowboy," Vicar growled. Jed froze. There was no time to lever the rifle, no time to dodge. Suddenly, a heavy cast-iron skillet flew out of the back of the wagon, spinning through the air. It clipped Vicar's shoulder, not enough to hurt him badly, but enough to make him flinch. It was Clara. She was standing at the back of the wagon, wild-eyed, another pan in her hand. That split second was all Jed needed. He dropped to one knee, the Winchester flashing up. He fired from the hip. The bullet caught Vicar in the thigh. The man howled, the shotgun blasting into the sky, shredding the branches of the pine trees above. Vicar fell, clutching his leg, cursing a blue streak. Jed walked over, kicked the shotgun away, and stood over the wounded man. He looked down with eyes as cold as the blizzard. "You tell Ransom," Jed said, his voice low and dangerous, "that he missed." Vicar glared up, pain etching his face. "You're a dead man, Vance. You can't hide her. The marshal in Denver. He's on the payroll, too. There's nowhere to go." Jed looked at the man's coat. The wind blew the lapel open, revealing a tin star pinned to his vest. A deputy's badge. Jed's jaw tightened. The law wasn't coming to help. The law was the one pulling the trigger. "Get up," Jed said to Vicar. "I can't walk," Vicar spat. "I didn't say walk, I said crawl." Jed pointed his rifle back toward the road. "Start crawling back to Cheyenne. If you stop, you freeze. If you come back, I kill you." Jed turned his back on the man and walked to the wagon. He checked the horses. Thunder had a cut on his flank from a splinter of wood, but he was standing. Grief was spooked but unhurt. Jed climbed into the back of the wagon. Clara was slumped against the crates, shaking, holding the children. "You threw a skillet," Jed said. It wasn't a question. Clara looked up, her face pale. "I missed." "You bought me a second," Jed said. "A second is a lifetime out here." He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. She wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter who didn't know how to fight yet. "Are they dead?" Toby asked, his small voice piping up from the blankets. "They're gone, son," Jed lied gently. "Go back to sleep." Jed moved to the front of the wagon and grabbed the reins. He snapped them hard. "Hyah!" The wagon lurched forward, leaving the blood-stained snow behind. They weren't going to the next town. The roads were traps. There was only one place left to go. They drove through the night, pushing the horses to the brink of collapse. Jed steered them off the main road, guiding the wagon onto an old logging trail that wound its way up into the foothills of the Laramie Mountains. The terrain grew steeper. The trees grew thicker. The air grew thinner and colder, biting into their lungs with every breath. By dawn, the storm had broken. The sun rose over a world of blinding white diamonds. The beauty of it was cruel. The temperature was 20 degrees below zero. The wagon hit a patch of ice and skidded sideways, the back wheel hovering dangerously over a drop-off that plunged 300 feet into a ravine. Clara gasped, clutching Rose tight. Jed wrestled the horses, his muscles straining under his coat until the wheels found purchase on the gravel again. He halted the team and jumped down. "Road ends here," Jed announced, opening the flap. "Wagon won't make the incline. We walk the rest." Clara stared at him. "Walk? Look at the snow, Mr. Vance. It's waist deep. The children—" "We wrap 'em up," Jed said, beginning to unhitch the horses. "We pack what we can carry. It's 2 miles up to the shelter. If we stay on this trail, Ransom's posse will spot the wagon tracks by noon. We have to disappear." Clara nodded slowly. She understood. Survival required brutality. They fashioned a travois, a simple sled made from 2 wagon poles and the canvas cover, dragged behind the horse. Thunder. They loaded the supplies, the sack of flour, the coffee, the ammunition, and the precious stovepipe. Jed lifted Rose onto the horse's back, wrapping her in 3 layers of blankets until she looked like a small bundle of wool. Toby had to walk. The climb was a torture Clara had never imagined. Every step was a battle against the snow. Her skirts, heavy with ice, dragged at her legs like iron chains. Her lungs burned. She watched Toby struggling ahead of her, stepping into the deep footprints Jed left behind. "Keep stepping, Toby," Jed encouraged, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Just like climbing a ladder. Don't look up at the mountain. Look at my boots. Left, right. Left, right." "I'm tired," Toby whimpered, stumbling. "I know," Jed said. "But tired means you're alive. Dead men don't get tired." Clara gritted her teeth, forcing her legs to move. "So where are we going, Jed? You said a shelter. Who lives up this high?" Jed paused to let the horse breathe. He looked up at the jagged peaks looming above them, grey stone against a blue sky. "Nobody," Jed said. "Not anymore. Used to be a mining claim. The Iron Divide. My brother and I worked it 10 years back. Found nothing but fool's gold and heartache. But the cabin is solid. Stone walls. And it's got the only thing that matters right now." "What's that?" Clara asked, panting. "A view of the only path up," Jed replied. "Nobody can sneak up on the Iron Divide. We see them coming 5 miles out." They reached the cabin just as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long purple shadows across the valley. It was a squat, ugly structure built of rough-hewn logs and river stones, clinging to the side of the cliff like a barnacle. The roof was heavy with snow, but the chimney stood straight. Jed kicked the door open. Inside it was freezing and smelled of rat droppings and old dust, but it was dry. "Home sweet home," Jed grunted. For the next hour they worked in a frenzy. Jed chopped dead wood from a fallen pine, while Clara swept the floor with a branch and set up the small stove they had hauled up. When the fire finally caught, roaring in the belly of the iron box, the relief was so intense Clara almost wept. They ate a dinner of boiled beans and hardtack, sitting on the floor. The heat slowly thawed their bones. After the children were asleep, wrapped together in a corner, Clara sat by the fire, holding her husband's journal. She hadn't opened it since she fled. Jed was cleaning his rifle by the window, watching the trail below. "You should read it," Jed said, not turning around. "I'm afraid of what it says," Clara admitted. "Fear keeps you sharp," Jed said. "Ignorance gets you killed. If we're going to fight Ransom, we need to know what he's afraid of." Clara took a breath and opened the leather cover. The pages were filled with Elias's neat, cramped handwriting. Maps, coordinates, lists of names. She read in silence for 20 minutes. Then, She gasped. "What is it?" Jed asked. "It's not just land," Clara whispered, her eyes widening in horror. "It's the water. Ransom isn't just fencing off the creeks. He's diverting the entire flow of the Sweetwater River. He's building a dam illegally in the canyon." Jed turned, his brow furrowed. "That river feeds the whole valley, the homesteaders, the reservations, the small ranchers. If he dams that up, he cuts off the water supply to 3 towns, Clara finished. Then, when the drought hits in the summer, everyone goes bust. They have to sell their land to him for nothing just to buy water. He's manufacturing a drought." "That son of a bitch," Jed muttered. "That's why he needs the book. That dam is on federal land. If the government finds out he's building it, he goes to prison for 20 years. Clara turned a page. "There's a name here, a witness, someone who helped him survey the dam site." "Who?" "A man named Silas." Clara stopped, correcting herself as she misread the smudge. "No. Waiting. A man named Victor Thorne?" "No. A man named Dutch Holloway?" "No." She squinted at the handwriting. "It says the engineer. Just the engineer." "Elusive," Jed said. "But it don't matter. We got the proof." "But we're stuck on a mountain," Clara said, the reality crashing down on her. "We can't get to Denver, and Ransom knows we're here." Jed walked over to the fire and warmed his hands. "We ain't stuck, Clara. We're waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For the storm to pass," Jed said. "And for Ransom to make a mistake. Men like him, they're used to buying what they want. When they can't buy it, they get angry. And when they get angry, they get sloppy." Suddenly, a low rumble echoed through the floorboards. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of distant explosions. Jed went to the window. He looked down into the valley, miles away. He could see tiny sparks of light moving in the darkness. Torches, a lot of them. "Is it them?" Clara asked, standing up. "Yeah," Jed said grimly. "And they brought friends." He turned to Clara. "Ransom didn't just send a posse this time. He hired the Pinkertons. There's 20 men down there." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. 20 men against 1 cowboy and a widow. Jed racked the slide of his Winchester. A grim smile touched his lips. "They ain't fighting a cowboy anymore, Clara," Jed said. "They're fighting a family. And on this mountain, the mountain decides who lives." He looked at the sleeping children, then back at Clara. "Tomorrow, we teach them why you don't hunt wolves in their own den." The morning sun didn't bring warmth. It brought visibility. And with visibility came the killing. Jed Vance stood by the shattered window frame, peering through a crack in the wooden shutters. The valley below, pristine and white just yesterday, was now scarred with the black lines of wagon tracks and the stomp marks of 3 dozen horses. "They're setting up," Jed murmured, his voice calm, which was more terrifying to Clara than if he had been screaming. 2 groups, one circling the east ridge to get the high ground, the main force coming up the switchbacks. Clara was on the floor, tearing strips of fabric from her petticoat. She was cleaning the cartridges for the Winchester, wiping off the grease and grime just as Jed had shown her. Her hands were raw, her fingernails broken, but they didn't shake. Not anymore. "How many?" Clara asked. 22, Jed counted, and they brought a Gatling gun on a sled. Ransom isn't taking chances. Clara looked at the heavy brass weapon sitting on the table, a Colt Peacemaker revolver. It looked too big for her hand. "What do we do about a Gatling gun, Jed?" "We don't let them get close enough to crank it," Jed said. He turned to the children. Toby and Rose were huddled under the heavy oak table, fortified with the sacks of flour and beans. "Toby," Jed said. The boy looked out, his eyes wide. You're the ammunition man today. When your mama runs dry, you slide her the reload. Can you do that?" Toby nodded, clutching a box of 45 rounds like it was a treasure chest. "Yes, sir." "Rose," Jed continued, his voice softening. "You keep your eyes closed and you sing. You sing that song your mama was humming last night, loud as you can. You don't stop until I tell you." Rose nodded, tears streaming down her face, but she squeezed her eyes shut. "Here they come," Jed whispered. The first shot didn't come from a gun. It was a shout. "Vance!" The voice boomed up from the rocks below. It was Colt Ransom. He was hiding behind a boulder 300 yards down, surrounded by men in long dusters with Pinkerton badges. "There's no need for this to get messy. Send the woman and the book out. You can keep the brats. I'm a reasonable man." Jed didn't answer. He picked up the Winchester. He adjusted the rear sight, accounting for the wind and the elevation drop. He aimed not at Ransom, who was well covered, but at the man standing next to the Gatling gun sled, a hired gun named Bassett. Jed exhaled. The cloud of breath vanished in the cold air. Crack! The shot echoed off the canyon walls like a thunderclap. Down below, Bassett spun around, his shoulder exploding in a spray of red mist. He collapsed into the snow, screaming. The valley erupted. A hail of lead slammed into the cabin. Bullets chewed through the logs, sending splinters flying across the room like shrapnel. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar of rifles firing in unison. "Get down!" Jed roared, kicking the table over to add another layer of cover for the kids. Clara scrambled behind the overturned heavy oak, the Colt revolver gripped in both hands. She watched the door. Jed had told her, "I'll watch the range. You watch the door. If that door opens, you pull the trigger until it goes click." Rose started to sing. Her high, thin voice pierced through the cacophony of gunfire, singing "Amazing Grace." It was a ghostly, surreal sound amidst the violence. "They're rushing the slope," Jed yelled, working the lever of his rifle. Clack-bang, clack-bang. Every time Jed fired, a man dropped in the snow. He was a machine, efficient and ruthless. But there were too many of them. "Dynamite!" Jed barked. He grabbed a bundle of 3 sticks he had tied together earlier, fused with a short lead. He lit it off the stove embers and hurled it out the window, aiming for the rock shelf, where the second wave of attackers was taking cover. Boom! The explosion shook the cabin's foundation. Dust rained down from the ceiling. The firing from outside paused for a heartbeat, stunned by the heavy ordnance. "Did you get them?" Clara screamed over the ringing in her ears. "Bought us a minute," Jed grunted, reloading. "But they're splitting up. They're going for the blind side." The blind side was the north wall of the cabin, where there were no windows, only solid stone built against the cliff face. Suddenly, a heavy thumping sound came from the roof. "They're on the roof!" Toby screamed. Men were climbing down the chimney. Jed spun around, leveling the rifle at the fireplace, but he was out of ammo. He reached for his belt, but it snagged on his coat. A pair of boots dropped into the fireplace, followed by a man in a buffalo coat, soot-stained and coughing, holding a knife. He lunged for Jed. Jed caught the man's wrist, and they crashed into the wall, overturning the water barrel. They grappled on the wet floor, the knife inching toward Jed's throat. The intruder was younger, stronger. Jed's old wounds were screaming. Another man dropped down the chimney. He saw Clara. He grinned, teeth black with soot. He stepped toward her, raising a pistol. "Give it up, lady," he sneered. Clara looked at him. She looked at her children behind her. She looked at Jed fighting for his life in the corner. Something inside Clara O'Malley broke. Or perhaps something was forged. She didn't tremble. She didn't beg. She raised the heavy peacemaker. It was heavy, shaking in her grip. "Center mass," Jed had said. Don't aim for the head. Aim for the heart. She pulled the hammer back. Click. The man laughed. You ain't got the guts. Clara pulled the trigger. Bang! The recoil nearly broke her wrist. The room filled with smoke. The man looked down, a look of pure surprise on his face. A dark blossom of blood was spreading across his chest. He dropped to his knees, then fell face forward onto the floorboards. Clara didn't stop. She turned the gun toward the man wrestling with Jed. "Jed, move!" she shrieked. Jed, hearing her tone, head-butted the man in the nose, stunning him, and rolled away. Clara fired again. The bullet missed the man, but shattered the stone of the fireplace next to his head, spraying rock fragments into his eyes. He screamed, blinded, covering his face. Jed finished him with the butt of his rifle. Silence returned to the room, heavy and suffocating. Jed stood up, breathing hard, blood dripping from a cut on his forehead. He looked at the two dead men on the floor. He looked at Clara. She was still holding the gun, smoke curling from the barrel, her eyes wide and dark. "You okay?" Jed asked softly. Clara nodded slowly. "I killed him." "You saved us," Jed corrected. "They're not stopping," Toby whispered from under the table. Outside, Ransom's voice floated up again. "That was your last chance, Vance. Burn it down." "Burn it!" Clara gasped. "They can't get inside," Jed realized, his face grim. "So they're going to roast us out." A flaming arrow thudded into the roof, then another. Then the heavy sound of oil bottles smashing against the logs. Smoke began to curl under the doorframe. The heat rose instantly. "We have to go," Jed said, grabbing the canvas bag of supplies. "Go where?" Clara cried. "They have the front surrounded." Jed moved to the back wall, near the woodpile. He started pulling away the heavy logs, revealing not a stone wall, but a rotting wooden frame boarded up with planks. "The mine," Jed said, kicking the planks in. A blast of stale, cold air rushed into the burning cabin. This cabin was built over the main shaft entrance to keep claim jumpers out. It goes straight into the mountain. "Where does it come out?" Clara asked, coughing as the smoke thickened. 2 miles east, Jed said. "On the other side of the ridge, near the old creek bed." He ushered the children into the darkness of the tunnel. Clara followed. Jed paused at the entrance. He looked back at the cabin, his brother's home. He took the last stick of dynamite, lit the fuse, and tossed it onto the pile of ammunition they had to leave behind. "Come and get it, Ransom," he muttered. He disappeared into the dark just as the roof of the cabin collapsed in a sheet of flame. The mine was a tomb. The air was thick and tasted of copper and rot. The only light came from a flickering kerosene lantern Jed carried, casting long, dancing shadows against the rough-hewn rock walls. They had been walking for an hour. The tunnel was narrow, held up by timbers that groaned under the weight of the mountain. Water dripped from the ceiling, cold as ice, landing on their necks like phantom fingers. Clara held Rose's hand so tight her knuckles were white. Toby walked close to Jed, stepping over rusted rails and discarded pickaxes. "Why did you leave this place?" Clara asked, her voice echoing strangely in the tight space. "You said you and your brother worked it." Jed didn't look back. "We found a vein, silver, rich enough to set us up for life. But we needed capital to get the equipment to dig it out. My brother, Sam, he went to town to get a loan. He met a man who said he could help." "Ransom?" Clara guessed. "No," Jed said. "Ransom was just a cattleman back then. This was a lawyer, a man named Atticus Finch. No, that ain't it." Jed shook his head, the memory blurry. "A man named Thaddeus Crow, a lawyer from Chicago. Crow drew up the papers. Said he'd partner with us." Jed stopped walking. He held the lantern up to a section of the wall. There were scratches on the rock. Desperate scratches. Crow sold the claim to the mining combine behind our backs, Jed said quietly. But they didn't want partners. They sent men up here. They collapsed the tunnel entrance while Sam was inside. I was in town. I heard the explosion. Clara covered her mouth. Sam. He died in here. I dug for 3 days, Jed said. I never found him. I killed Crow a week later in a saloon in Denver. That's why I have the scar. That's why I stopped being a miner and started being a drifter. He looked at Clara. Ransom isn't just stealing water, Clara. He's using the same lawyer. Crow didn't die. I shot him, but he lived. He's Ransom's legal counsel. The man who forged your husband's death certificate? That was Crow. The realization hit Clara like a physical blow. The web of corruption wasn't just local. It was a machine that had been grinding people down for decades. We have to get this book to the marshal, Clara said, clutching her chest where the journal lay. For Sam. For Elias. We will, Jed promised. They saw daylight ahead. A small, ragged hole in the rock face, covered by vines and snow. Jed kicked the brush away, and they stumbled out into the blinding white brightness of the afternoon. They were on the eastern slope, overlooking a frozen creek bed. The air was fresh and clean, a stark contrast to the suffocating mine. We made it, Toby cheered weakly. Quiet, Jed hissed. He scanned the tree line. It was too quiet. The birds weren't singing. Something's wrong, Jed muttered. Jed, look! Clara pointed down the slope. Standing on the frozen creek, waiting by a saddled horse, was a man. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat and a silver star on his chest. It's the sheriff, Clara cried, relief flooding her veins. Sheriff Grady, he found us! She started to run down the slope, pulling the children. Clara, wait! Jed yelled, reaching for her. But she was already sliding down the snow, desperate for safety. Sheriff Grady looked up. He was a tall man with a pock-marked face and eyes that looked like wet stones. He smiled when he saw her. Mrs. O'Malley, Grady called out, walking forward with his hands open. Thank God, we saw the smoke. I thought you were dead. Clara collapsed at his feet, exhausted. Sheriff Ransom. He burned the cabin. He tried to kill us. Jed Vance saved us. Grady looked up the slope, where Jed was standing, his rifle leveled at the lawman. Vance, Grady nodded. Put the gun down, son. The war is over. Is it? Jed called down. Where's your posse, Sheriff? Why are you alone? The U.S. Marshals are on their way from Laramie, Grady said smoothly. I rode ahead to secure the witnesses. I'm here to take you into protective custody, Mrs. O'Malley. He reached a hand out to Clara. Give me the children. Let's get them warm. Clara looked back at Jed. Jed hadn't lowered his rifle. Don't do it, Clara, Jed warned. Look at his saddlebags. Clara looked. Sticking out of the sheriff's saddlebag wasn't a blanket or a canteen. It was a distinctive gold-handled cane. The same cane Alderman Blackwood had used to push her into the mud at the train station. That cane, Clara whispered. That belongs to the alderman, Ransom's partner. Grady saw her eyes widen. The smile vanished from his face instantly. In a blur of motion, Grady drew his revolver and pressed the barrel against Rose's head. No! Clara screamed. Drop the rifle, Vance, Grady shouted, hiding behind the little girl. Drop it or I paint the snow with her brains. Jed froze. At this distance, with Rose as a shield, he couldn't take the shot. He slowly lowered the Winchester and let it drop into the snow. Good, Grady sneered. Now, Mrs. O'Malley, the book, hand it over. You work for them, Clara sobbed, clutching Rose's arm, trying to pull her away, but Grady's grip was iron. I work for the winning side, Grady spat. Ransom owns this territory. Did you really think you could run? Crow has already drafted the sale of your land. All we needed was the loose end tied up. Let the children go, Jed said, walking slowly down the slope, his hands up. Take me. Take the book. Let them walk away. You know I can't do that, Jed, Grady said, shaking his head. Witnesses. Remember? Grady cocked the hammer of the gun against Rose's temple. The distinct click echoed in the silent valley. Give me the book, Clara, Grady ordered. Last chance. Clara reached into her dress. Her hand trembled as she pulled out the leather-bound journal. The evidence of murder, of theft, of the dam. The only thing that gave her husband's death meaning. Here, she wept, extending it. Grady grinned, his eyes shifting for a split second from Jed to the book. That was the mistake. From the tree line behind Grady, from the direction of the town, a shot rang out. It wasn't the boom of a Winchester or the crack of a pistol. It was the sharp, high-pitched report of a long-range buffalo gun. Sheriff Grady's hat flew off his head. He staggered, dropping the gun, clutching his right shoulder where a massive slug had just shattered his collarbone. Rose scrambled away, running to Clara. Jed dove for his dropped rifle in the snow. Grady fell to his knees, groaning, looking toward the trees with shock. Who? A figure stepped out from the pines. It wasn't a marshal. It wasn't a Pinkerton. It was a woman. She was dressed in men's trousers and a buckskin jacket, holding a massive Sharps rifle. She had long, silver-streaked hair tied back in a braid. Jed squinted. He started to laugh, a dry, rasping laugh of disbelief. Well, I'll be damned, Jed wheezed. Clara hugged her children, looking at the stranger. Who is that? That, Jed said, picking up his gun and walking toward the wounded sheriff, is the engineer. The woman lowered the Sharps rifle, the smoke drifting lazily into the crisp mountain air. She didn't smile. She walked down the slope with a limp, her boots crunching on the snow, her eyes fixed on Clara. You look like him, the woman said, her voice raspy, like dry leaves. You have Elias's stubborn jaw. Who are you? Clara asked, still shielding Rose, though Sheriff Grady lay groaning in the snow, incapacitated. Name's Martha Matty. Ross, the woman said. But in the survey camps, they just called me the engineer. I was the one who drew the plans for the dam. I was the one who told Elias the concrete mixture was wrong, that the foundation was built on sand, and that Ransom was cutting corners to save a nickel. Jed walked over, kicking the pistol away from the bleeding sheriff. I thought you were dead, Matty. Elias said you disappeared in the rapids. Ransom's men threw me in. Matty spat. I washed up 5 miles downriver. Broken leg, ribs crushed. I've been living in a trapper's shack, waiting. I knew Elias kept a journal. I knew eventually someone would come for it. She looked at Clara. You have the book? Clara nodded, handing the leather-bound volume to Matty. Matty flipped through it, her calloused fingers tracing the diagrams. This is it. But this book alone won't hang him. Ransom owns the judges. He'll claim these are forgeries. So we fought for nothing? Jed growled. No, Matty said, closing the book with a snap. The book is the map. But I am the key. I can testify to where the bodies are buried, literally. I know where they dumped the excess blasting powder. I know where they hid the original land deeds they stole. We can't get you to a court, Clara said, despair creeping back in. The sheriff is Ransom's man. The town is bought. Matty looked at the sheriff, who was pale and shivering. Not all of it. There's a federal hearing tomorrow morning in Cheyenne. The governor is coming down to approve the final water rights contract for the Stock Growers Association. It's a public forum. Jed holstered his gun. If we walk into Cheyenne, we'll be cut down before we reach the steps. Not if we don't walk, Matty said, pointing toward the tree line where a steam-powered logging winch sat rusting near the tracks. "And not if we bring the mountain with us." The Grand Hall of Cheyenne smelled of expensive cigars, pine boughs, and corruption. Colt Ransom stood at the podium, a glass of champagne raised high, while the governor sat beside him, his pen hovering over the water rights treaty that would crown Ransom the undisputed king of the territory. "To the future," Ransom toasted, his voice booming. "To order and control!" The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall didn't just open, they were kicked off their hinges. A swirl of snow blew into the warm room, followed by three figures who looked like vengeful ghosts. Clara O'Malley, bloodied but unbowed, Jed Vance, looking like the Grim Reaper in his dusted coat, and Mattie Ross, the dead engineer, limping on a crutch. "I object!" Clara's voice sliced through the stunned silence. Ransom dropped his glass, shattering it. "Seize them!" he roared, pointing a trembling finger. "They are fugitives, murderers!" "We are witnesses," Mattie stepped forward, ignoring the deputies who hesitated at the sight of Jed's hand hovering over his Colt. She slammed Elias's leather-bound journal onto the governor's table. The thud echoed like a gavel stroke. "And this is the death warrant you're about to sign. Ransom isn't building a reservoir, he's building a tomb. The foundation is sand. If that dam fills, the pressure cracks the bedrock and drowns this entire town under 50 feet of water." The governor froze, looking down at the undeniable diagrams in the book. He looked up, his face pale. "Colt, is this true?" Cornered, Ransom's veneer of civilization shattered. He snatched a hidden derringer from his vest, leveling it at Clara. "I built this territory. I am the law." Before he could pull the trigger, a thunderous crack erupted from the balcony. Ransom screamed, his pistol spinning away as a bullet shattered his hand. High above, 7-year-old Toby lowered the heavy buffalo gun he had rested on the railing, smoke drifting from the barrel. Jed Vance didn't hesitate. He vaulted the stage, driving his shoulder into Ransom's chest, sending the cattle baron crashing into the orchestra pit. As the deputies rushed in, they didn't aim at Jed. They aimed at the man writhing on the floor. The reign of Colt Ransom was finally over. The trial of Colt Ransom and Thaddeus Crow lasted 2 weeks. They were sentenced to hang for the murders of Elias O'Malley and 3 others. The dam project was scrapped, and the water rights were returned to the homesteaders. Clara didn't leave Cheyenne. She rebuilt her house, not as a victim, but as the owner of the O'Malley Land and Survey Company, with Mattie Ross as her partner. And Jed? The last time Clara saw him was at the train station, the snow finally melting into spring slush. "You could stay," Clara had said, holding Rose's hand. "We have room. The children, they need a father." Jed had tipped his hat, covering the eyes that had seen too much. "They got a father, Clara. He's in that book you carry. Make sure they know him." He climbed onto his horse. Thunder. "Besides, cows get separated from the herd. Someone's got to go find them." He rode out, a shadow against the setting sun, a guardian who belonged to the wild, leaving behind a family that was finally, truly safe. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the legend of the Iron Divide. A mother's love, a cowboy's redemption, and the bullet that brought down an empire. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button right now. And if you want to hear the next saga of the Wild West, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss a chapter. Thanks for watching, and keep the fire burning.